So I was watching Pocahontas with my daughter the other day. I haven't watched that movie like all the way through really in more than a decade. And in the very opening song, they sing about all the things that they're going to find, the Englanders as they're traveling over to America right before they're about to leave England, about how all the beautiful things of the New World that they're promised to by the Virginia Company. And I thought, my first thought was, well, what is the Virginia Company, right? Well, looking into it, it's kind of self-explanatory. The Virginia Company was the expedition name, the company, the trading company that was put together by the King of England. And so the Virginia Company went to America, the United States, the now United States. And they landed in the year 1607, and they began to set up a settlement. They were mainly trying to find new places to conquer for trade exports. And side note, they did end up, the big export that kind of saved that expedition was tobacco. There was a much sweeter tobacco that was able to be grown in the United States that they couldn't get over in Europe. So that was 1607, and they established a real big, very successful settlement known as Virginia. And it was in the area of Virginia and actually spanned much of the eastern seaboard. And through that era of time, you know, the first 1600 to 1630, it expanded all the way up to Maine and down to the Carolinas. So it was a really big swath. The reason I found this interesting was because upon looking at when the Pilgrims landed in America in 1620. Now, the sort of information that I feel like I learned in school. Now, I know that the Pilgrim story has never been accurate. You know, the Thanksgiving didn't happen the way that it was kind of taught to us in elementary school. But looking at the dates, it really sunk into me how the Pilgrims were not the first people to settle America. They were kind of far from it. When the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, there was already a lot of settlements happening along the United States. I mean, big trade open, big economic operations out of Virginia. And there were other large settlements too around that time. And then I think to Mason, that's just, not far from Milford. That settlement was settled by somebody who I believe came down from Rye, so that was already settled. But Mason was settled in 1623, so just 3 years after the Pilgrims landed. So this idea that the Pilgrims were the first kind of modern Americans, if we can use that term just for the sake of this argument, is so incorrect. They were not even close. So then it got me thinking, well, why? Why is that the predominant story that's sort of told? You know, it's like, well, when the Pilgrims came over on the Mayflower and landed on Plymouth Rock, that's always sort of when you're explaining it in school, that's kind of just the story that you tell. So why is that the case? Well, Thanksgiving, that story obviously was just supercharged by the holiday itself. And there's very picturesque and there's a lot of like nice things about that sort of like pagan look and all that. But one of the reasons too that I can kind of deduce or find is because Virginia is not a ideological story. The representation of America being this country that you go to for freedom from oppression is very much in line with what the Pilgrims were coming to America for. They were under religious suppression in Holland, and they came to America for religious freedom, while the Virginia Company was coming for economic power. And there was also a lot of slave trade with the Virginia Company. A lot of that tobacco that I just spoke of was being harvested and produced by slave labor from Africa. So it's a little bit less a feel-good story, but for them to be so close, we're talking the span of 20 years, and for Virginia to be such a huge settlement, a huge economic export operation, that area was already largely dominated by the English Empire. And the Pilgrims were just a small group of people that, while had a lot of influence over the rest of the United States development, it's just not a true story. It's such a weird one to just pick and to latch onto. Again, I don't think any historian is trying to argue that the Pilgrims were the first ones over, but just culturally, it's weird that we have just latched on to this very incorrect piece of history.